talk and a historical talk. I will tell you about, we'll start with standards, because the JCP is all about standards. And I'm going to talk about why standards are important, and then I'll talk about how we develop standards for Java. So give me a moment here. I'm going to skip ahead a long way. Then I'll go back to the beginning. Okay, so the world that we live in would not exist, could not function if it was not for standards. There are lots of organizations that define standards. The JCP is one of them. A standard is basically just an agreement between human beings that they will do something in a particular way. That might be a process, it might be a social thing, it might be a way of constructing something physical. But they agree that if they do things in a particular well-defined way, then life is easier than if we don't. So let me give you an example. I'm on a little tour here. We're taking lots of flights. Think about how the process of airline flights are organized. Now, I'm not talking about the technical aspects of how you get this monster thing off the ground. That's another matter. But how is it that I can go from Rio to, where did we go first of all? I don't even remember. Guanya, and from there to here, and from here back to Rio, and so on and so on. We do that because we have an agreement on something as simple as an airline timetable. So there we have an agreement between humans that this would be an efficient way to organize transport from one place to another. We don't have to do it this way. You could imagine a situation where there are aeroplanes and a bunch of people have them and control them, and they take off from random places and they go to other random places at random times. And then you'd never get anywhere. So the first thing we agree is, well, let's take off from one place. Let's call it an airport. And if they all take off from this place, then at least you know where to go if you want a plane. But if I want to go from here to Rio, and I just have to go to the airport and stand around until somebody says, oh, there's a plane over there, it's going to Rio in 1 hour, would you like to get onto it? That's also inefficient. So we've agreed, well, let's agree in advance. Who will fly from where to where and at what time? And let's publish that information so that I don't just have to show up at the airport and wait for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, which there are still some parts of the world where you have to do that, I'm told. But instead I can kind of make my plans in advance. So that sounds simple. But there's more to it than this. And I'll get into some of this stuff in more detail later. But first of all, we've got to agree on how we're going to communicate that information. Do I just show up at the airport and hope that I bump into the pilot of the plane and he tells me as we drink a cup of coffee that he's leaving in 1 hour? No, we have an agreement at the airport that we will have this stuff up on a board. But even better, we agree that we will publish it in advance through some means so that I can plan my trip a day or 2 or 3 in advance. We have to agree on how we communicate that information, what language we're going to use, what the meaning of the words is that we're going to use, and we have to agree on the times that we're going to be using. If I'm going from here to Rio, no big deal, we're in the same time zone. If I'm going from here to London, and they say the plane is taking off at 4 o'clock and arrives at 10 o'clock, is that 4 o'clock Brazil time? Is that 4 o'clock London time, or whatever? So the point is that life would be very chaotic if we did not have these agreements about how we do stuff. And at the simplest level, that's what standards are. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. Just a little bit about me. I'm kind of a mixed up person. My family comes from Ireland originally. I was born in England. I live in the United States, in California. I'm married to a lady who is Turkish, so I'm a little bit of everything, and I love to travel, and I'm very happy to be back here in Brazil, which is one of my favorite places. I've been doing computer stuff, IT stuff for more than 30 years, which I suspect is as long or longer than some of you have been born. So I got grey hair, and you're students, right? Most of you, all of you. And I used to be a professor, so I get to play professor. I'm going to kind of lecture and talk about history and stuff like that, but hopefully you'll find it reasonably interesting. I started out a long time ago programming in assembly language. I moved to the US to work on something they called a word processor, which in those days was not software at all. It was a physical machine. It was basically a personal computer running CPM, control program for microcomputers, which kind of came before MS-DOS. And it was a dedicated machine. It had a keyboard and floppy disks and a printer, and I worked on the software that went inside that, all written in assembly language. And then I moved on later to work on porting the Unix operating system to various systems, including the very early IBM PCs. And as a result of that, Scott McNeely from Sun Microsystems, who thought that PCs were toys, at least he said that publicly, and the only things that mattered were his SPARC workstations, but he could see that PCs were getting more and more powerful and more competitive, and he thought, maybe I better have a backup plan. And if these PCs really take off, maybe we better have my version of Unix, Solaris, running on them. And since the company I work for was the expert in porting Unix to various systems, and particularly to PCs, he bought the company, and I spent many years working on Solaris for Intel systems. And then I moved into the Java world. This is the first computer, at least I think it is, that I worked on, an IBM 360 mainframe. I say I think so because I never saw it. Because in those days, you didn't see the computers you worked on. This is what you saw, a punch card machine. You'd sit down there and you'd type away your program, and you'd end up with a bunch of these cards, and you'd have a stack of them, and then you take them, you give them to someone in an office, and they'd take them away and they'd feed them in to this machine. And 24 hours later, they'd come back and tell you you missed a comma in, line 17 or whatever, and you'd have to start all over again. So you learned very quickly to read your program very carefully and to debug it in your mind, Very different from today, when you just type it in, let's see what happens. Okay, I've got a syntax error, the system will tell me and I'll fix it in 30 seconds. This was a 24-hour turnaround time. So it was a big advantage when later I was given a computer of my own, this is the first one that I had. 1 megahertz 6502 processor, 8 kilobytes of memory, not megabytes, not gigabytes. The only storage it had was a little cassette player that took the same cassettes that you would record music on. And we programmed it in assembly language, 6502 assembly language, which is, here's an example. I don't know exactly what this does, it doesn't really matter. When I did this talk the other day, Ottavio pointed out that basically assembly language is what bytecode, Java bytecode, is derived from. Java bytecode is effectively an assembly language, not for a real physical machine, but for a virtual machine. And the advantage, of course, of that mechanism is that so long as you port that relatively small virtual machine to a new piece of hardware, all the stuff that lives on top of it, the gazillions of lines of Java code, will just run. It was a brilliant idea. But in those days, this was what I was coding, and there were no libraries of any kind. If I wanted to read what the user typed in on a keyboard, you had to go to a particular location in memory, and you had to say what value is stored in this byte in memory, and go look it up in a table and say, they pressed the A key. And similarly, if you wanted to display something on the screen, you had to put a particular value in memory, and then a character would show on the screen. Or there were little graphics things. This is not bitmapped at all. There were just these, what they called, they'd be a straight line or whatever. You could form boxes and so on. But everything we had to do ourselves. But I learned a lot in doing that. Okay, that's me in the background and why I'm a history buff. I used to study history and economic history and so on before I became a computer geek. So now I'm going to talk about standards from a historical perspective. Remember, when I say standards, just an agreement between people on how to do something. History is important because, as Confucius said, if you want to think about the future and make the future, you have to understand where you come from. You're all young people, you're going to be defining the future of computing 30, 40 years from now. It would be a good idea if you knew a little bit about the history, at least I think so. George Santayana, the philosopher, said the same thing. So let's go back to the very beginning. The very first standard was probably, remember I mentioned about the airline thing, well, if we don't agree on the meaning of words, we ain't going to get anywhere. So the very first standard probably that humans ever came up with was to agree that if you make a particular sound, it means whatever. This is from Humpty Dumpty, Alice in Wonderland. Humpty Dumpty said, I don't want to do that way. Words mean whatever I want them to mean. But of course, under those circumstances, people can never communicate with each other. So we need to have an agreement. We learn to write down, create symbols for writing down words and ideas, which was a very powerful notation, very powerful idea, because now ideas can be propagated through time. Before this, the only way of doing this was for somebody to sit and learn a long poem, typically they were poems or story, by heart, and then they would repeat that to the next generation and so on and so on. Very inefficient. So writing was good. Number systems, so we can learn how to measure stuff and count. Currency, medium of exchange. If I have, I don't know what, a donkey and you have potatoes, and I want potatoes but you don't want a donkey, well then we need some intermediary thing where we can agree on exchanging stuff. Currency was very important, so important that you maintain the value. You see, you notice some of these are kind of wobbly around the edges. This is precious metals, and people would take these snippers and they would shave the edges off the coins, because if you do that, just take a little bit off several coins, then you can melt them down, you make one more. So suddenly you made yourself 10% profit. But over time, the value of the currency declines and declines. And this was so serious that governments would step in and regulate very seriously the issuance of currency and how it was regulated and so on. So seriously that in England in the 17th century, Isaac Newton, the natural philosopher, the guy who invented gravitation, discovered gravitation, theory of gravity, was appointed master of the mint in England and given the job of controlling the currency. And he put in a regime, a very serious regime of going after counterfeiters, and if you were caught as a counterfeiter in those days, you were executed. And executed not in a simple manner just by hanging, but hanging, and then before you're dead they take you down and they cut you open and pull out all your guts, and then they cut off your arms and legs. Hanging, drawing and quartering. So some standards are so important that if you violate them, you can not just be executed, but be tortured. You may think this only happened a long time ago, but you may remember a few years ago in China when there was a lot of fuss about contamination of baby formula, baby foods and stuff like that. Ultimately the guy who was responsible for basically the Chinese equivalent of food and drug regulation was found guilty of corruption and he was executed. So execution is a serious possibility if you overstep your bounds. So I thought maybe in the software world we could try the same thing. So if you build some software that doesn't comply with the relevant standards, maybe if we hung people as a punishment they would try harder. But nobody's taken me up on this yet. We invented ways of measuring time and space. This is Galileo, discovered the moons of Jupiter. Once you can kind of measure stuff up in the sky, then you learn to navigate, you can learn to explore, map the world, weights and measures. There was a very early measure of length called a rod, which was a little over 16 feet. This, I think, is a satirical drawing from the 17th century in Germany, suggesting that how you define this standard is you go to church on Sunday and you take the first 16 men who come out of church and you measure the length of their feet and you add them all up, and that is the length of a rod. Since then, we got a little more sophisticated about how we measure length and how we record the measurement of it. For many, many years, the meter was defined, there was an actual physical piece of metal that lived in Paris. That was the official meter. And it's only been the last 100 years or so that they got rid of that. These days we measure it in terms of the wavelength of light. It's got much more sophisticated. But we have to have agreement on how long something is, how big something is. In the Middle Ages in Europe, there was an emergence of guilds, which were basically collections of craftspeople who said, we are going to get together. This is a goldsmith. These guys would say, the materials, the goods that we manufacture must meet certain standards of quality. This way, this protects us, it protects our customers, and it's a good thing all around. So if you've met the standards, you've got what they call a hallmark. This is a way of saying this spoon or whatever this is made of silver of a certain quality. Printing standardized the use of language and the propagation of ideas, because once you can actually write something down and propagate it automatically, then there is less chance of things being diverging over time. And of course, ideas are very subversive. Before the printing press, the only people who had books were basically the aristocracy and the clergy, and the common people just basically were fed whatever they wanted to feed them with. Once the printing press existed, then ideas multiplied, and that led to the growth of democracy and so on and so on. There are also standards for regulating quality. I mentioned the Chinese case, so the quality of food and drugs, and then qualities for health and safety, so that the world that we live in is safe and useful and healthy for us. Let's move into modern times. Industry and commerce can't develop without something as simple as an agreed upon way of doing accounting. How do we know whether a company is making money or is not making money? There's a standardized method of recording money that comes in and money that went out, called double entry bookkeeping, invented I think